This week, Michael and I turned up the nitrous. And then after we finished at the dentist, we watched The Fast and the Furious.
Welcome back to How Did You Miss This? A show where we watched pretty important movies that some of us missed the first time around. I'm Evan Tuller-Hickey, and with me as always, Michael Hansen and Chris Shane. Today, we are discussing the 2001 film that launched a mega franchise, The Fast and the Furious. I'm going to go on record here, as I have gone on record before, saying that I unironically love this franchise. This probably doesn't surprise you guys. You probably hated this film. Chris and Michael, how did you miss this?
I can tell you that this is a movie that was set up in every way to be all the things I don't like. It is a movie about cars, which I don't have much use for or love of. It was an action movie that was, from everything I read and heard about it, a very nonsensical kind of story and whatever. And especially as the series has grown and continued over the years, like a thing that I've become even that much more aware of, where they're like, physics, gravity, don't need those. Let's go. We have cars. And so I think having missed the original because it's like, cars and whatever, and hokey action movies and whatever, not my thing. And then just knowing kind of that the series has gotten even more, wacky and crazy over time. I guess I was just like, this isn't a thing for me. But I'm very excited to talk about what I thought about this movie. Michael, what about you?
I think you captured incredibly well, because the original one, when I heard about it, there was nothing to hook me in or reel me in, like nothing about it at all, exactly for the same reasons you did. West Coast cars, tank tops, like there was just nothing. And then as it became bigger and bigger, it tapped into all of these things that we're even less interested in. So how did I miss it? Here's a big admission, listener. I missed this. I went back to this, and please don't make the same mistake I did. I went back to listen to watch a movie called Fast and Furious, which to my dismay turned out to be not the first movie in the franchise. That's a 2009 movie. The actual first movie is a 2001 movie called The Fast and the Furious. So not only did I miss it, but I missed two of them in a row. So I'll be very interested in talking about, what I liked about this particular one.
It's understandable when you get this many movies in this series that at some point you just run out of titles where you're just like, I don't know, still Fast and Furious, maybe more Fast and more Furious, still pretty furious. Like there's just only so many titles you can have, right? Evan, I'm curious for you. How many times have you seen this movie?
I have seen this first movie three or four times. The movie, the first of the franchise that I saw in theaters was The Fast and the Furious Tokyo Drift, and that is the third one in the series, and it really kind of captured my heart. I love car racing games. Is one of my absolute favorite genre of video games. Video games where you go fast and physics really isn't much.
That was the wrong F word. You said fast and physics. No, it's furious.
It's in furious. The physics. I really like. I like the fast and no physics. So I'm not super into like the Gran Turismo games, but boy, oh boy, do I loves me the Need for Speed Hot Pursuit.
Right.
So this film just kind of like it really tapped into that part of my geekdom, and I really unabashedly, unironically, unequivocally love these movies. Again, like so many of the movies that I said that I've loved that I've made you watch. These are flawed movies. These are incredibly imperfect movies, but they bring me a huge amount of joy. And not the least, because this is one of the few original idea films that then goes on and spawns a mega franchise. And we're recording this with the 10th the Fast and Furious movie ready to come out. 11th, if you count the Fast and Furious present Hobbs and Shaw. And that is an amazing thing to me.
So maybe on that note, just, talking about where this movie came from and its original kind of IP that came in here, like let's talk a little bit about how this movie came about. And I think the interesting thing about this is actually based off of, an article all about street racing in New York City. And it's like the real life of street racers and, what does that look like? How does that sound? What are they like? What is the lifestyle? What is the culture? Which then kind of spawns this movie. And this is written by Gary Scott Thompson. And I think one of the interesting things that happened is, that story got moved from New York to LA. And suddenly it goes from just being this New York story to being this multicultural cast in a very multicultural city telling an insane story, but we'll get into that. And so I think it's a fascinating beginning for this franchise because it is this, subculture that I don't think I'd really seen or heard of. I don't think anybody was really aware of before this movie came out. And suddenly, it's thrust into the spotlight.
I think it is interesting as the spawn of a franchise, because I thought about this to say this movie is to other franchises what Rambo 1 was, or you look at Rocky 1, where you say these were very realistic, very sincere movies that try to tell a real story. And then you get into Rambo 3, you get into Rocky 4 and Drago, and it's just like this a whole different thing. Very entertaining, very, very successful, but they're very different from the thing that spawned both of them. This movie, I will argue, it takes a lot of really serious turns and makes like some real points about what you mentioned around the culture. There are a whole bunch of things that they do that I think show respect to the thing. And then later they take off into this, well, what could we do with a tank driving off a bridge? Which is more like the Rocky 4 thing, right? But like as an idea that spawned a thing, it's really interesting to kind of keep that in mind when you look at the subsequent movies.
And I think that one of the reasons this movie kind of resonates the way it does is because they moved it from New York to LA and made it a multicultural cast. And that's really thanks in part, into large part, to one of the rewriters on the film, which is David Ayer, who would be maybe best known for writing Training Day. Before he did the rewrites on the Fast and the Furious, and he came up in LA, and LA is all about car culture. Like we said, sort of in the Enter the Dragon podcast, you cannot downplay the fact that this is like a major action franchise with a multicultural cast.
Yeah,
and that is really, really, really cool. And to see it come from sort of these very humble beginnings, sort of $38 million budget, Vin Diesel in one of his sort of first leading roles, I think Pitch Black had come out just a little bit earlier than that.
He didn't have a main role in that movie. So that's where he played Riddick for the first time, which turned into the Riddick series. But that was just still kind of a supporting role within that story.
And and an early role for Paul Walker. I think he had just done The Skulls, which I believe Rob Cohen directed as well, the director of Fast and the Furious. And so there was already a connection there. But like Michelle Rodriguez, not particularly known at that time. Jordana Brewster, definitely not known at the time. I feel like it feels like the kind of the biggest names in it were like Paul Walker and like Ja Rule.
Yeah, it is interesting going back, because looking at this movie at the time, looking at what Vin Diesel had done up to then, it's like, oh yeah, that's right. He had a supporting role in Saving Private Ryan. Okay, yeah, right. He was Compazzo in that. And then it's like, oh yeah, he was in Boiler Room. That's right. And it's like, yeah, Vin Diesel actually had a number of really good films. And interestingly, like, he got his start. One of the how he got noticed by Steven Spielberg to get into Saving Private Ryan was actually making producing, directing his own movie called Multifacial, which is all about being this multi-ethnic person stuck in this interview or auditioning process, and then sending that, getting it that at Cannes, getting it noticed by Spielberg, writing Spielberg, and then kind of tying this into this series, which, tying it back to the whole thing of like, this is like a very multicultural cast with lots of people from different places, and having Vin Diesel kind of connected into it and being like, oh yeah, he's actually made some really good movies before he got into this series, which I'd kind of forgotten about. So it's really cool that he got his first, big step up into a leading role in this film.
So, this movie comes out the summer of 2001. As we said, sort of $38 million budget, which is a small-ish budget for a studio film. It goes on to make over $200 million worldwide. So it's obviously tapping into something. So-so reviews when it comes out. People are like, it's fun. Go for a brainless movie. Definitely, people aren't seeing the insane potential that this movie ends up having. 74% score for the audience on Rotten Tomatoes, and not even the best of the franchise. Chris and Michael, now that you have seen it, you're aware that the 10th movie is coming out this year. So what did you think?
I judged this and again, I watched the worst movie in the franchise first. So by the time I watched this one, I was like, hey, this is very good. Because for me, everything was a step up. Literally everything about this, except for, CG and some of the effects that they were by then 8 years older. Everything else was a step up. So I was actually really pleased with this movie. I thought they treated characters well. They had much more realistic representation of the whole thing, like the racing culture and the people who attend and the motorheads who are there. So yeah, no, I quite like that part.
I will say that I genuinely enjoyed this movie. I think, to Evan's point, there's definitely flaws in this. There are quarter-mile flaws that they could have a full-on race on. But I mean, I think it's a really fun and genuine movie. It's got some plot around it to make it happen, which is just enough to make it go. But like, I think some of the performances in here are great. I was surprised by how good I thought they were. I was surprised at how just powerful at points this movie feels, and how fun this movie feels at points. And it's like, it's a popcorn summer movie, right? Like, it's enjoyable for that reason, and it's fun to watch. And, you don't necessarily leave a changed person, but it's a fun watch while you're watching it. So I was happy to have seen it. Hey, Evan, you've seen this a bunch of times. What did you think of this movie?
I love this movie, Chris. I love this franchise. I am the Fast and the Furious ride or die. I will watch all of these movies a quarter mile at a time.
Doesn't matter whether you watch them a quarter mile at a time or by an inch. You still watch the movies. And on that note, we'll take a quick break. And on the other side, we'll talk about all the things that make this movie so fast and so furious. All All right, welcome back. We are going to start our engines and boost with some NOS because that's what you do apparently to get things going. So we are going to be talking about the Fast and the Furious, spoiling everything. So you have been warned. What's this movie about? Well, this movie revolves around an undercover cop, Brian O'Connor, who has to investigate a gang of street racers who are suspected of hijacking trucks. Brian becomes enamored with the street racing culture. He develops a friendship with Dominic Toretto, the leader of this gang who's suspected of these hijackings. And as he gets closer to Dom, his sister Mia, and the crew, he finds himself torn between his loyalty to the police and his loyalty to his new friends. Things heat up as the investigation heats up, and things escalate between Brian and Dom. So this is a story that in lots of ways makes a lot of sense or just enough sense. In other ways, kind of has some plot holes, which Dominic Toretto could jump his car through. I'm curious about the base storyline for each of you. Like, is this Point Break in Cars?
This is absolutely Point Break in Cars. I think that's the big takeaway from this one, right? I mean, you've got Brian O'Connor as the Johnny Utah character. He's the good-looking undercover cop who is infiltrating the subculture gang of close-knit people, falls for one of the women in that gang, is harassed by the right-hand man of the guy who runs the gang, so not Gary Busey in this case, develops a bromance with
the main target of the investigation.
This case, Vin Diesel rather than Patrick Swayze and his incredible head of hair. And in the end, lets the person go.
Except instead of surfboards, cars.
Instead of surfboards or skydiving.
Or skydiving, yeah.
Cars. And that's the movie.
Do you think that's what the pitch was for this movie?
Point Break with Cars?
Yeah.
I wonder if they sort of pitched it as like kind of like a Western maybe. But I mean, Point Break with Cars is basically it.
Yeah, and I think that's not even a complaint. Like, I don't think that's a plot hole or an issue. I think that they do it really well because what they do, and this shocked me because again, I walked into this kind of expecting to not like it, but what shocked me was like he did so many at so many turns he chose to tell the truth, and he went against the obvious decisions. He could have gone against the, like you say, the right hand man who'd been a jerk the entire time. They'd had a conflict, but he chooses to save him, and he chooses to, for the opportunity to save his life, he had to give away who he was. And like all of these things that I thought were really meaningful, and the acting supported it. So I actually thought this carried really, really well. Like I thought it was very well done, very well written, and very well acted. So I was like, okay, I'm sold.
Now, I mean, it's driven in large parts by nonsense. I'll just say nonsense, where they're like, we have to stop these truck hijackers who hijack trucks that are in motion instead of, stealing them when they're parked, which seems easier and no one's around. Also,
that wouldn't be cool. They wouldn't be stunt driving cars underneath trucks and shooting harpoons and climbing onto things. The stunts in this movie, the practical stunts in this movie are phenomenal. And that's the thing that I love the most about all of these movies is the stunts.
Let's talk about those practical stunts, because I think those practical stunts are probably the standout in this movie, right? The driving, the cars, the races, like all of the stuff with cars is great. It's great. I don't know a better way of saying it. Like when they rev engines and you feel your house shake because of just the sheer throttle of the thing, it's great. And so let's talk about it. I mean, this is a movie that revolves around race scenes and races. And like, how good do you feel that those race scenes are?
I mean, I think the race scenes are great. I don't like shaky cam, but I feel like that this movie and the cinematography really put you in the car. You feel like you're racing along, and when we did Vertigo, we talked about how the Vertigo zoom kind of became invented and became a standard use in the industry. And cinematography comes out of that movie, or a piece of cinematography comes out of that movie. It's the same thing with, shockingly, The Fast and the Furious. Changed the way that picture cars were filmed in movies. Something called the Mick rig, named after Mick Rogers, who was the stunt coordinator and the second unit director of the film, where they put the frame of the picture car like super, super low on a flatbed. So it's basically like, it looks like it's on the road rather than where it was usually like quite raised up on the back of like quite a high. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so you can get these really cool, really like almost realistic, but very dynamic shots. And I thought it was really lovely that the first truck heist they do, the truck moves out and it's got Rogers written across the side of it, Rogers with a D. And it's such a nice call out to a guy who really kind of stamped the series, and changed the way that these kinds of action scenes are shot.
I also thought like they did and maybe it was a limitation of the technology. They had to do so many practical things because you couldn't afford or practically to do all special effects. But I really liked how serious they were about the racing. So including they actually made an effort of closing off all the streets and the whole thing around like tracking the police stuff that in the later movies are like, no, let's not do that. That doesn't make a difference. It's cooler to just have you driving in regular traffic. And now also the very selective use around like zooming into inside the engine and seeing what's going on, and when they're like igniting the nitro. I really liked how they had this inexperienced Paul Walker character have such faith in technology, but not getting the point around like the racing part. You're racing the other person. I thought that came across super well. So I thought that was probably some of the best parts of this movie. I thought they did it extremely well.
And I'll even just say the driving throughout, the practical stunts where, especially later on where Dom is like, hits the truck and flips his car, and you get this shot of a flipping car going over another car underneath it. And you're like, oh, that they actually did that. That is a very cool shot that they made there. And, to your point, Michael, there's no special effects here. Like, that's a car going over a car. Like, wow, that's an amazing shot. The stat I read about this movie was that they wrecked 78 cars in the making of this movie, and apparently that's a very low car body count for this series. But I mean, it's the movie that started it all. You got to start somewhere. But like, I mean, you definitely get a sense of like, okay, they blow a couple up, they wreck a couple, doing off the pipe jumps and stuff like that. But like, there's just something amazing about the way that they chose to do that. It feels really cool and like unique when they're doing some of those things. It's not just a car hitting a truck and flipping over. It's a car hitting a truck, flipping over another car with one of your main people in it. I'm like, okay, that's at least a unique take on a thing that you've seen a million times.
One thing that might not fit into the category of practical effects is, and again, I watched the 2009 version before I watched this. So Vin Diesel in 2001 is what you would call a pretty big guy. Vin Diesel in 2009 is like 1.5 times the size of that in terms of muscle mass. I could not believe how they evolved that character in this movie. Here he is a big guy, but but then later when you see him, it's like, holy crap. So that technology, if you will, is also advanced.
I think that's actually really interesting, Michael, because it gives us a really nice segue in talking about the evolution of these films, but also that's something that you see, like, wait till you see, Fast 10, where he's, a mountain of a man, especially, once he had to start fighting The Rock in the 5th installment of the franchise. Then you just have two giant men getting bigger and bigger and bigger. You see that in all the superhero movies too. You watch Captain America, the First Avenger, and you're like, yeah, Chris Evans is pretty jacked in that. And then you watch like Infinity War and you're like, damn, his like shoulders, like how does he fit through doors? In terms of the evolution of these films, this is a series that has had an extraordinary amount of staying power, that has done some really incredible pivots, and I think in some ways has had its fingers more on like the pulse of what the cinema going audience wants more than just about anything else, because it's gone from like they're heisting DVD players in this movie. They're like saving the world by like, I think, number 7 or 8. It's like, we need to stop like the nuclear codes from falling into the wrong hands kinds of thing. They become superheroes. And in the middle, it becomes sort of like the Italian Job style of heist. Like this is like, we gone from like kind of petty robberies, still very cool with the moving trucks and the grappling guns and things like that, to hauling safes behind cars in the 5th movie, to they go to outer space in the 9th in a car. I mean, like just chef's kiss.
I think that's one of the things I'm interested to see after seeing the first one is the action movie inflation that inevitably happens, right? How do we top this? How do we do something better? How do we do something bigger and whatever? And seeing whether that jives with me or whether it makes my kind of like cars become worse. I'm very interested to see where it does go. But just bringing us back to number one. I'm very curious then, the stunts, the races, the cars all look amazing too. I just wanted to point that out. And part of that, as they have these giant scenes is partly because they did these call outs to like the race community. And they just had 1,000 people show up with their cars, which are all real street racing cars and real street racers, all just to hang out and make these scenes look real. And they certainly they feel like a movie version of a street race, but with real street racers there. Like, I'll give them that, okay, sure. It's maybe not quite, I don't know. Maybe it is a real street race. I'm not a street racer. It could be true. The one thing I will say that in terms of how this movie looks that I don't think stood up quite as well to the test of time, 20, 22 years or whatever since it first came out, the CGI isn't great.
Oh, no, it is not.
the motion blur as they hit the NOS and are racing at high speed, like similar as you're like in Star Wars, jumping from one point to another, and the stars just blur beside you into solid lines of light. I'm like, okay, I don't think the cars are going quite that fast. Maybe they are. I don't know, but there's a few things like that where I didn't love the shot into the engine when they boost the NOS. So some of those CGI effects I found maybe didn't still hold up quite as well, 20 years later. But thankfully, they didn't use them much.
I think like it would be unfair to ask them to stand up, because it's a little bit like watching Star Wars 1 Phantom Menace or watching the first Matrix, where you would say like when you watched it, you would have said, oh, that is incredible. And they look at it later, or Lord of the Rings, first one. There are a whole bunch of ones where you kind of look at it and you go, well, clearly they're not going to stand up as well now. But I thought that the idea of how they used the effects, I thought was very good. Doing the thing around explaining to just a regular movie watcher to kind of show what happens with the nitro and the pistons and all this, like that, I thought was very clever. And they didn't do it with every shot. They did it with like the big, significant racing one. And you go like, oh, yeah, that. the technology behind it, but then also the human element of when do you ignite it. So I disagree. Like, I think maybe I should put it this way. I was less fussed about like how does it look, and I thought that they just more about how they used it, and I thought they used it really well.
I think one of the big drivers of this movie is, pun intended, two of the main actors who were kind of getting their start here. So Walker and Diesel are Dom Toretto and Brian O'Connor. I'm curious what each of you thought about those two as kind of the leading men in this one. Well, how did you think they took on these roles, and how did they do? Evan, I have a feeling I think I know your answer, so I'm curious about Michael maybe.
I've only watched the two movies that I feel are the same movie. I felt I got to know them 8%, each of them. Like they said a few things, and you get to see a little bit of emotion and something about honor and code and this and that. But it's just I did not feel like I got to know the characters. And as a matter of fact, like after the 2009 movie, I couldn't even remember who the characters were and their names, because it just wasn't important to the movie. Like, they never really established who they are or why they matter. So I don't think that the characters were that important, but in their interactions, some of the things that they said, like I could believe I need to do this thing because it's important to my code and where I come from. I could believe that. It's just, I couldn't tell you much about these characters other than, oh, my father died or this happened, and now I haven't had the balls to drive his car since. Okay.
I think that in terms of chemistry on screen, that Walker and Diesel have it. Like, I totally believe that bromance, and it's really interesting watching this movie and going like, oh damn, like these two guys are stars. Like they have real star quality, and they have different kinds of charisma that they're bringing to the screen, and it works really well together. I feel like they're kind of made bigger than the sum of their parts by it. It to me really sort of is core to the movie, and to your point, Michael, of not getting who the characters are or seeing who the characters are. I think that's definitely true in the case of Walker's character, in the case of Brian, that he truly is kind of like a blank slate. Like we really know nothing about him except that he is a cop and he likes to race things, and that is it, and he's handsome, and that's it. Like, that is all we know about him. And to me, that actually works really well because Toretto is so focused on family, and this is the one constant. So, between races, there is this idea of family, and it is the thing that I think is really at the core of why these movies have had the longevity that they've had, and what is really at the core of them is this idea of family, and everybody kind of wants to be a part of that, and they really, really play to that in every subsequent film gets more and more and more into this idea of family. No, we've got to save this guy because he's family. No, we don't leave him behind. He's family. Or, she may have turned on us, but we know she's coming back to us because she's family. And you can see this idea of family and this core group really kind of sucking Brian in because he is such a blank slate and seems to have nothing else going on. Of course, he would be attracted to this really tight-knit group of people with a shared history, who like to barbecue and drink Corona. But we'll see that spin out more and more in every subsequent film until it becomes really the underlying thing of the franchise that pins it.
I mean, I will say I can't really fault him for choosing to hang out with the, young, attractive, cool, partying race car drivers over the like bald, uncool cops who make iced cappuccinos. I will say that I think for me, the big surprise watching this movie, I thought Paul Walker was okay. I think the chemistry between Walker and Diesel was great. I found myself surprised at how much I really liked Vin Diesel in this movie, especially having missed this series, right? Not having seen any of the Fast and Furious movies. But like having seen other things where he was the leading guy, like, Triple X or the Riddick movies or whatever, where I was just like, nope, not for me. I don't think this is my guy. Coming back and watching the first Fast and Furious, I was like, oh, I kind of get it now. I see why somebody would be like, Vin Diesel's cool. I like Vin Diesel. I'm like, I like Vin Diesel a lot in this movie. And I think him as Toretto is a very perfect fit. He seems like to really be in his element in that role. To your point, Evan, doing the like, the head of this misfit little cast of misfits or whatever who have all come together and kind of found each other. And he's kind of the dad that he lost and is giving to everybody else. I'm like, I really liked him in that role. Sure, it's over the top at times, but so is the whole movie. And I think he strikes that balance just right of being like, honest and serious and whatever at the right times, and being just like badass at the right times and being over the top at the right times. He strikes the right notes in this movie, which could have been really cheesy and corny otherwise, and I think without him could have really gone off the rails and didn't. And like I think he's a huge part of that. So I was genuinely surprised at how great I thought he was in this movie. And I mean, I get it now, so that was awesome. I'm curious what you guys thought about some of the other folks. Like, this is a few fresh faces coming out of this movie, especially Michelle Rodriguez. Like, this is an early role for her too.
Yeah, I thought Michelle Rodriguez was great in this. I think that she is a little bit underplayed in this. She definitely becomes a much bigger part of the franchise as it moves along, and the love story that becomes sort of like operatic in its scope between Letty and Dom really is another one of those big sort of like family kind of thing. And becomes a very important part of the 10 films. I just saw Dungeons and Dragons: Honor Among Thieves, which Michelle Rodriguez was kind of the muscle and the heart of that film. And she was fantastic in that. And it's so cool to see her. I think this is like maybe one of her first couple of films. I think she did Girl Fight. Yeah. Maybe before this, and that's basically it. She's like, she has a presence on screen. I think it's great when she like cold clocks that guy at the races, and
the cousin or the brother or whatever, Johnny like Tran,
asserting herself, where a lot of the women in this film are window dressing.
Yeah,
she really. Kind of,
she's a girl who's into cars and into racing just as much as all the other characters. Brings an authenticity
to it. Yeah.
To your point, I wish I'd seen more of her in the movie, but she definitely stood out for me than the rest of the gang, which I thought was great, and then just maybe wish we'd had a little more of her time. But
and it's interesting because having seen the worst movie first, there's this. You get the sense that she carries such an importance later on, but I never had a chance to see it. And this movie didn't really give the full clues because she just has a couple of appearances. But almost in an opposite way, I thought that Vin Diesel's sister, Mia, like she was much more realistic in this one. She seemed like an actual person, someone who would just kind of show up and have the conversations and be there. So I thought she was quite believable. And when you ask the question around the characters, I think it's very contextual because even the Johnny Tran character is so stereotypical in one way. But when you see the scene when the feds raid his home, you really get the sense of this is going to set the guy off, because this is like such a big insult to him, like an honor insult in front of his family, the break-in.
Yeah, when his father slaps him like that,
right?
That is
massive,
hardcore.
And same with Paul Walker's boss. He also seems a little bit like, he doesn't make any difference. But then he's got other things where he shows that, he's a real character. He actually seems to care for him. He gives him proper advice. So there are many of these characters that by themselves, like, I couldn't say that they're great characters, but they have scenes where you go, oh, I get you. That was really, really well written and well acted. So it's not super consistent in this movie, but I think so many of them have a chance to really shine.
Yeah, speaking of Paul Walker's police captain, like I love when Paul Walker's like, just give me a cigarette, and the police captain's like, no, don't give him a cigarette. Like, it's just like he's genuinely worried. Yeah, will you quit? He's like, he's worried about his health, and gives him like genuinely good advice.
That's exactly what I mean. Exactly, brilliant.
Yeah, that's really nice. And that's a police captain character you don't really see, which is kind of neat too.
The other thing you often don't see with the police force is them setting up base in some sort of mansion that they have taken over for some reason, and then making each other iced cappuccinos. I mean, I was very curious about the whole like undercover setup thing in a commandeered mansion or whatever that was. I found that just confusing, but kind of delightful.
It makes me wonder if that is like an LA thing, because like when they make fun of LA cops in like Die Hard or in Beverly Hills Cop, you get that kind of sense of this like weirdly pampered police force.
Yeah.
And each city in LA has its own police force. And so maybe this is just like a specific Beverly Hills thing or whatever. I don't know. But it's something that I've seen in a few movies now that just, it makes me really giggle.
So a few of the things that stood out for me in the story, and this is some of those, quarter mile wide plot holes. There's a few points where I was just left scratching my head a little bit. Like there's when they're escaping from the street racing and the cops are chasing everybody, and Dom just decides to pull into a parking garage and then walk away from his car when he was already getting away. I was like, what? Of course, it then turns into a chase scene, and then Brian comes and saves him. The whole like robbing trucks that are in motion instead of, the 8 other scenes where you've snuck into a garage at night. Okay, cool. The whole conceit of now the truckers are going to fight back because they're tired of getting robbed. Like, oh, okay. There's a whole bunch of stuff that doesn't really make sense. Does it matter?
Nah. Like, I mean, like, does it? No. It's just like, to me, it's like, all right, you could hijack a truck while it's sitting at the docks, or you could, grab everything while you're racing, and that's it. Just, it looks cool. I think a lot of it comes down to it looks cool. It's like, okay, well, that the truckers are now like, this dude's going to have a gun and he's ready for them. Like, all right, it's just cool.
Enough to set the scene.
Yeah, it's just enough to set the scene.
And it would make for a very short movie.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's an element of that, like we talked about with Amadeus, to say, does it matter about the historical accuracy? Nah, it makes for a good movie. It's a good story. Of course, it would make so much more sense if they just robbed the thing when it was standing still. Or if they're that good at shooting, maybe they could have shot the tires and the truck would have just come to a grinding halt. Like, there's so many things they could have done. But again, this is cooler, so let's go with the cooler.
Yeah, they didn't want to damage all those DVD players in the back. It comes down to like, if Wile E. Coyote could send away for all of the Acme stuff, why couldn't he like send away for food?
And I mean, for the listeners who weren't there at the time, DVD players were carefully calibrated and balanced so you couldn't shake them. So therefore, they had to.
This time travel moment brought to you by
Old Man Michael.
Amazing. I think one of the things that I'm curious whether you would, if they were, rebooting this in 2023, is whether they would choose to name the massive race Wars. That seems like a terrible idea in 2023. Am I wrong there?
You are not wrong. That was one of the notes that I wrote down. It's sort of like race wars. Yikes. I mean, to be fair, a lot of the portrayal of race in this film is along racial lines.
Yeah.
Like, it's like, okay, all of like
the Asian gang,
the Asian
Latino
gang hangs out.
gang.
Yeah, exactly. Is that the United States or just North America in general, though? Yeah, man, I don't know. But it also lends this kind of extra coolness to Vin Diesel, to Dom Toretto, because he's kind of like welcomed by
everybody. He's the
respected by everybody. And it's like, why does he have beef with Tren? Well, it's because he slept with his sister. Right. So
I think it's not just that, but I really like that first scene when Paul Walker shows up and people showed up, like they walked over to him, and I thought, oh, this is going to be a fight. It's like, no, this is not going to be a fight. They're just talking. It's like, wow, this is incredible.
Yeah.
I totally paid attention to this race wars thing because it felt like, actually, when you talk about a reboot, that feels like the next The Purge movie, The Purge Race Wars. Like, I thought it was the weirdest thing to hear. Here, you get a ticket to the race wars. We're going to, like, it was just, wait, did I get this wrong? So, no,
All right, maybe that's a good spot to take a break. And on the other side, we'll talk about how this movie sounds and how that makes the movie feel even more awesome. And welcome back. So one of the things that makes this movie really stand out is all the things car. They look good. They drive fast. And one of the things that stood out for me is they sound cool. Like,
oh, they sound so good.
They sound so good in this movie. So tell me what you thought about the way that this movie sounds and the way it brings kind of those cars to life in your ears.
Yeah, I mean, I watched this with headphones on. For the first time, I've watched this film with headphones on, and oh man, it was great. Like the engine revs, the tire squeals, like just everything. The sound mixing in this movie is just fantastic. It just really jacks your adrenaline and adds to the whole kind of like bang, like. Street racing is cool. Not the message maybe they want to get across, but street racing is cool.
I agree. I don't know what street racing sounds like, but I imagine it sounds like this. And so much of that had to do with the fact that it felt so real, like the practical effects. Like you could actually believe that this is what it sounds like when you do a proper slide through a curve. I was just like, okay, yeah, that's amazing. It really added to it. So I think they did an amazing job, no doubt.
Absolutely. I will say that there is some research to Evan's point about whether it should make it look cool or not, that there's a higher propensity for people who watch these movies to also speed. So, mission accomplished, I guess. But it is definitely a part of the movie that makes it awesome, is just like, it's supposed to be these like big, powerful, cars that people have put their heart and soul into. And you get that when, it turns on and you just like feel your living room vibrating from the power of these cars. And it's like so well done. The other part that I thought was pretty well done about this movie in terms of how it sounds was the soundtrack. Like this is a very early 2000s, hip hop, metal, like a bunch of stuff that's in there. Like, how did each of you find the soundtrack played into this film?
Dude, it's like, this is a banging soundtrack. Like, it's just the whole, everything about the sound in this movie, I feel, is meant to hype you up. And it really, I think they do a great job of that. And like, shout out to Ja Rule for providing the emceeing on that final track over credits. Like it was pretty dope.
I think so you just touched on it. You said the final track. I thought the end credits music was better than what showed up in the actual movie. I didn't remember as much from the things that were in the movie, but I thought that the end credits were very good. Generally speaking, though, there was nothing that stood out as a negative, which is it did its job. Like it did exactly what it was supposed to be there to support every scene. But I particularly remember the end credits and thinking, yeah, that's very good.
Now, Chris is a hip hop head. Like, how did you feel about the soundtrack?
I mean, this isn't necessarily stuff that I was listening to in 2000, but I think it does its job, and I think it plays like it's the right music for the people who were in the scene, right? And I think there was that sense of, you know, if you were at a boxing match, it always felt like somebody was coming to the ring with a new song, you know, like to your point, it's getting you amped up and hyped up at the right times and like, all right, a race is going to happen. And like the right music comes in and everybody's playing the right music in their car. You know, when everybody's like driving somewhere, you've got the music going and that kind of stuff. So it's like as much as personally, I don't necessarily love all the songs, I felt like they were right for this movie and right for the people who were, you know, playing the songs or whatever. I will also say, like, when you tie it all together, this was a soundtrack that did really well. This was it went platinum. It was like, you know, charted up to like top 10 and on the Billboard list and whatever. So like well thought out, you know, for me, this is, not to throw shade in your direction, Evan, but this is like what a well done soundtrack sounds like when you throw a whole lot of music at the movie.
Was that shade about Empire Records soundtrack?
Only a little bit or a lot. But like, I was like, okay, I get it. It's in context. It's different by character. Like, I thought it was well done. So like, I appreciate it, even though it's like individually that wouldn't be what I picked, but like, I don't pick the movies or the songs that I like to go into movies, you know, like, so I thought it was perfectly well done for this. Before we go, I had a handful of questions that I was very curious to get your thoughts on. So one of the things I was reading was that in the original attempts to cast this movie, the two key roles of Dom Toretto and Brian were originally going to go to Timothy Olyphant and Eminem. What would that movie have looked like?
I mean, I'm trying to think 2001 Timothy Olyphant. Okay, so this is just like pre-Deadwood?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, you know, I think it would be a very different movie. I don't think it would have been a movie that would have survived this test of time. Certainly not, you know, launched 1,000 sequels. I think that there's something about the blank slate that is Paul Walker. Eminem comes in with Eminem-ness. I could see Eminem maybe cameoing as the part of Jesse.
He could have been part of the gang. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah,
he would have been fine in the gang, but yeah.
I think that it's like, you know, I was saying before that Brian being a blank slate is so important to the film. I think that having someone like Eminem there kind of pulls you out of that. And as for like Timothy Olyphant as Dom Toretto, I'm just not seeing it, especially because Vin Diesel is just like, he is Dom Toretto. Like that is who he has become of playing this character over the last like 22 years. But I think that it also doesn't give us that kind of platforming of kind of like multiracial cast.
Yeah, I agree. I thought it was fascinating when I was reading that basically this movie got green lit because they were going to get Timothy Olyphant into the role. And then he backed out because he just previous, like the year or whatever before, Gone in 60 Seconds. He's like, I don't need another car movie, which, I mean, yay for all of us, I guess. I think that worked out just fine.
I think it's not that simple because all of these what ifs, you know, it's hard for us to see now because we've seen the success, like you said, of 22 years. The thing that would have made it work or not work would have been the chemistry. That particular combination on screen, if that had been something, sure, it would have been a different movie, but that might have been incredible. It's just so hard to see now because we have the weight of all of these other ones to kind of look against. But it would be super interesting to see the screen test for that combination and seeing like, oh, whoa, that could have gone in such a different direction.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Eminem passes on this because he's going to do 8 Mile. And I'd love to see, a crossover on that one, though. Just a scene.
Vin Diesel in 8 Mile.
Vin Diesel in 8 Mile freestyling against Eminem as Dom Toretto would be a thing, I think. That would be a good thing. I'm very curious for like, this is a movie like Evan has clearly kind of touched on it. Like this launches a whole 20 years of movies that is still going strong, has made billions and billions of dollars. Like, what do you think it is about this movie that kind of helps touch off this franchise? And I'm curious, as somebody who hasn't seen any of the other movies, Michael's at least got one up on me, even if it's a bad one. But like, what is it about this movie that you think, tapped into it and like led us down this path to this successful series?
I think it's about universal themes. Like you already mentioned it. There's underlying code, family, friendship, honor, a rush to try to kind of like fight through certain things, do the right thing. And like, I think that there's something there that just kind of is going to last forever. So I think that that's enough to kind of carry it on. Then the execution of an individual sequel is going to be good or bad, but I think that there's enough there that you go, okay, yeah, like there's a common theme that people from across anywhere could tap into and run with.
Yeah, I think there's, all of those things that we've kind of touched on, that universality of and heavy underpinning of family, the fact that it truly is a multiracial cast. So a lot of people really feeling like they're seeing themselves reflected on screen. There's also that just like racing cars is cool, and they do a really, really great job with practical racing. And you have to remember that this is also at a time, these early films coming out of this franchise, that like action movies are getting more and more and more CGI'd. And, you're seeing, the third Matrix movie, or the Lord of the Rings movies, which do some really interesting practical things, but, you can really see where those heavy CGI things come in. And then you've got this movie that has really cool practical stunts, and not a lot of things were doing it at that time. It's the same way that John Wick comes out and you're like, damn, like I haven't seen action choreography that just feels like it's hitting in a long time, because it's just superheroes now batting each other around. This feels so visceral. There's something so visceral about the action in these films, and then there's something so tender and something so deeply touching about the heart of these films and the family. And so you combine those two things, and I think they are sort of the films that we, maybe not the films we wanted, but the films we needed. This is
the Batman of movies.
Yeah, this is the Batman of movies. There's the other takeaway.
I'm curious then, and I think just kind of tying into that superhero connection. Did two questions. Number one, did both of you catch the post-credit scene?
Oh yeah.
And number two, did they start doing an MCU before MCU did an MCU? Like, were they doing the superheroes like movie structure before Marvel jumped on the bandwagon? Because I think like there's all these things here, which, to your point, Evan, like it seems like they were ahead of the curve on like where movies have moved to over the last 20 years.
Yeah, I think that they might have been. And certainly like always having their finger kind of on the pulse has been one of the reasons why this has been a super successful franchise. And it's great to see something that went from kind of basically an original IP, intellectual property, to where it is now, because we don't have a whole lot of those out there right now. Everything. I mean, now there's 11 of these movies, and it's like, okay, well, it's run its course. But like this and John Wick really are the two kind of like big franchises that came out of something original, you know, in this century. Everything else is comic books, basically, and video games.
But it's also interesting you ask about the end credits, because last week we talked about Enter the Dragon, and it was funny to see that, this was shot in an era where end credits were less than 30 seconds long, and then they were done, because, we had already introduced key points in the intro of the movie. Whereas something like this goes on long enough to have 3 songs and then a end scene. So it's just like things have changed in so many ways since then.
Well, I think that is an excellent place to call it. So that's what we thought about The Fast and the Furious. We'd love to know what you thought about this movie. If you punch the NOS to go into overdrive, let us know. And you can find us on Twitter at How Did You Miss This? That's HDYMT_pod. And while you're there, take a look at some of the movies that we're going to be watching soon. Send us any questions or ideas that you have that you want us to cover on the show. And if you enjoy what we're doing, do us a favor, rate, review, subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you happen to be listening. And we're going to be back with you next week when we're going to be watching Glengarry Glen Ross and seeing whether that movie still earns its coffee or whether it's something that should have stayed missed. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you then.